This is Play-by-Playcast.
Is that faster than a Greyhound?
The podcast about play-by-play guys. For play-by-play guys, by, I'm told, a play-by-play guy.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Now here's the host of Play-by-Playcast, Tom Bodett. Wait, the Motel 6 guy?
We'll leave the light on for you.
No, Joel Godet.
Joe Godet.
Joel.
Joel?
Joel, with an L.
Okay, here's your host, Joel Godet.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
They do have a timeout. Decide not to use it. Curry, way downtown. Bang! Bang! Oh, what a shot from Curry! With 0.6 of a second remaining.
This is the 80th episode of Play-by-Playcast. Thanks as always for clicking subscribe and or download, joining us once again here on a Friday morning. My name is Joel Godet, coming to you, as Colt Cabana would say, live from the studio apartment. 80 episodes in, and the second to last episode of 2017. It will be our first full calendar year as a podcast coming up on next week's episode, but a lot to get to before we get to that. As always, you can interact with the podcast on Twitter at PXPcast. The podcast is published on Facebook as well at my page, Joel PXP, if you look that up. And you can find me on Twitter as well at Joel Godet, G-O-D-E-T-T, J-O-E-L-G-O-D-E-T-T. I've heard from a bunch of people over the last couple of weeks. And thanks for reaching out. Last couple episodes have gotten some really good responses. Len Casper this past week from the Chicago Cubs. Jake Zivin, our first soccer guest from the Portland Timbers, was episode 78. And the numbers on Boog Sciambi's episode number 77 a couple of weeks back have been awesome as well. As always, our back catalog, totally free, totally open to you if you want to scroll back through the previous 79 episodes. But love the feedback. If you enjoy the podcast, what you've enjoyed about the podcast, it's awesome to hear from people or people that have gotten stuff out of it, feel like it's made them better broadcasters. Super fun to hear from you guys. So thank you guys for reaching out over the last couple of weeks. And, I groveled last week on the podcast saying everybody on podcasts asks you to go rate and review. I feel like it's you have to do it. I don't know. It's like it's in the unwritten rules. But I last week I said rate or review the podcast. If you like it, give us 4 or 5 stars. If you like it 3 stars or less, maybe not. But a whole bunch of you obliged last week. So I guess I'll ask again. Hey, if you haven't rated or reviewed the podcast yet, you can just flip over in the iPhone app, or if you're listening on an Android or on Stitcher, same thing. Just throw a couple of stars or a quick note our way if you've enjoyed, if you've learned about the pod. And certainly on Twitter, reply to the tweets about the podcast. Tweet at the guys who are on the podcast. Let them know that their time was well spent. That not just I myself got something out of it doing the interview, but that people out there were able to take something from it as well. All right, let's dive into it. You don't want to hear me ramble. Mike Breen is our guest today, the television voice of the New York Knicks, and of course the voice of the NBA Finals. And for my money, which, what's that worth? I don't know. I think for a lot of people's money, though, one of the best television basketball broadcasters out there today. So I was uber stoked to get to have Mike Breen on this podcast. And we cover a really wide-ranging swath of things. Mike was more than generous with his time, covered a bunch of topics. We start, I'll come back to where we start, but we get into, kind of his origins in news and being able to do more things and be versatile. His thoughts on the birth of sports talk, because he was kind of there for it, so he guides us through a little bit of that. Talking about being on air in New York City and what it's like to be a play-by-play guy in media market number 1 with a fan base like the New York Knicks. We'll talk about the technical side of what makes good basketball play-by-play, what makes good basketball play-by-play locally versus nationally, having experience on a regular basis at both levels. We'll talk about working with his partners, what it's like working with Clyde Frazier, what it's like working on a national level with the 3-man booth of Mark Jackson and Jeff Van Gundy, which is a hoot to watch and listen to, and kind of how he's the point guard for those guys and how he makes all of that work and how those 3 guys really gel together as well as they do. We'll touch on Bang, obviously the big 3-point call. We'll talk about feedback and his own critiques of his own work, which I think is one of the more insightful and one of my favorite parts of our conversation. So we'll touch on kind of his self-critique and the feedback system that he gets even to this day, several decades into being the voice of the New York Knicks and one of the more respected voices of basketball play-by-play. Where we start, though, is with a guy named Dean Darling, who might be a good guy to have on the podcast at some point in the future. But when Mike Breen started his career, it was actually as Dean Darling's color analyst for the Marist Red Foxes. That's where he got to start in the MAC, the MAAC, as opposed to the Mid-American Conference. But the MAAC, Marist Red Foxes, Mike Breen on television was a color analyst. And we touched to start things off with what he learned from that experience and how that helped mold who he is now, eventually launching the career of the voice of the New York Knicks. So without further ado, let's dive right into the podcast. On the penultimate episode here in 2017, it is Mike Breen from the New York Knicks. Enjoy.
It was a different way to look at a broadcast because, first off, Dean was such a polished play-by-play announcer. One of the best guys I've ever worked with. And he showed me the proper way to get your partner involved. He showed me when was probably the best way to turn the volume up. When's the best way to lay out? He just had a great feel for play-by-play. So to just watch him do his craft, sit next to him, and be a part of a broadcast where you really, you're entrenched in the broadcast and you saw the way he handled all different situations. It was a great learning experience. And then to be the color commentator and have this, job that I had to, inform the viewers in a certain way and knowing what I wanted to say, I got a real feel for what analysts might be going through at a certain time. It's hard for an analyst in a big moment to have to be quiet while the play-by-play guy does his thing. And it taught me that because you sit there and you want to talk. And quite frankly, throughout the game, the analyst has a lot to say. So it really gave me a nice window into what they're going through during the telecast. And he was just such a pro, and he was so patient because it was the first TV job that I ever had on the air. That I learned a great deal from him.
What are you thinking in that moment? Because I feel like a lot of people nowadays, early 20s, would sit there and be like, "What am I doing here in the color role, trying to figure this out?" How did you approach it from the standpoint of, like, I kind of really want Dean's job in the long run, but let me get what I can get out of this while I'm here?
Well, two things made it very easy. Number one, I just love basketball, so to be able to part of any broadcast of a basketball game to me was as fun as it gets. And the second thing, I received wonderful advice when I was at Fordham. I interned at WCBS News Radio 88 in New York City, and the sports director was a gentleman by the name of Ed Ingles. And Ed, to this day, is still a guy that I call and talk to and get feedback from and ask him questions. He told me very early, the best thing I could do early in my career is get out of my comfort zone. And by that he meant, when you get out of college, he says, you take any job that gets you on the air, whether it's news, whether you're being a disc jockey, it doesn't matter. Get out of your comfort zone, because if you get out of your comfort zone, and he especially emphasized doing news, he said, if you can report on news stories that you don't know a lot about, it'll force you to be more of a reporter. It'll force you to be a little more focused in trying to figure out what to say and what to write, because it's not a subject that you know very well or not a subject that you're very comfortable with. And it was a great, great piece of advice because, my first job was at a radio station in Poughkeepsie, and I was covering the Poughkeepsie School Board, the Dutchess County Legislature, all different types of events and topics that I did not know anything about. And it forced me to ask more questions and really be careful on how I wrote the story and broadcast the story. So then by the time I started doing sports, and now I'm doing a basketball game, boy, it seemed so much easier because I knew the topic so much better. Yet at the same time, I also developed better habits in terms of covering something and how to approach it, and how to write it. It was a simple but a brilliant piece of advice that really helped. So I've been telling that ever since to young broadcasters who want to do sports. Don't be afraid to take jobs in other areas in the field, because you get out of your comfort zone in the long run. It will make you a better sportscaster, because now you're doing something that you have passion about and know a lot more about. Yet at the same time, you get those building blocks on and how the best way to approach stories and broadcast stories are.
Loaded question, because I know there's a couple of dots in between there and getting to the Knicks. But how did you come to become involved with the New York Knicks?
I was working, again, another off-air job. I was working as the producer for a sports talk show on NBC Radio. Jack Spector was hosting a show on NBC Radio. NBC decided to try something different. They still had IMUS in the morning, they had Howard Stern in the afternoon, Soupy Sales in midday, and then they stuck this sports show on at night, which didn't seem to fit, but they wanted to try it. Because there really, at the time, there was no WFAN, there was no All Sports Radio. There was only two sports shows in New York. One was Art Rush Jr. on ABC, and the other was the Fordham radio station at WFUV.
Was that one-on-one back then, too?
Correct.
Wow.
And I think, started working for the show, and they changed hosts to a guy named Dave Sims, and Madison Square Garden Network decided, you know what, this is a pretty interesting show. Maybe we could simulcast it. So the network started televising the show. We'd do it down at the Garden, and it was simulcast on NBC Radio and MSG Network. And I was the producer of the radio, and the producer of the television side was a gentleman by the name of Mike McCarthy. And we formed a great friendship, and he knew I wanted to do play-by-play, and that was the connection that was made. So based off my relationships through the simulcast as a producer, I'd given them tapes and was hoping to do some play-by-play, and I started doing some other play-by-play as well during that time. And that was really the connection that got me hired to do the Knicks pregame. The first year on radio, I did pregame, halftime, and postgame. And then Jim Carvelis, the great basketball announcer, he was the guy. They didn't renew his contract after the first year, and I was able to get the job. I'm sorry, that's a little long-winded.
No,
but that's what happened.
What was sports talk radio like back when there wasn't any? And in a one-on-one's more of an interview show. So kind of how did you mold what you guys were doing and kind of cracking a new space?
Well, one-on-one, they did have interviews, but there was basically phone callers.
Okay.
That really was kind of the niche, because we had so many different callers who had, you think FAN has some characters. Boy, oh boy, did we have some characters. In fact, we one time we threw a lunch or a picnic lunch.
Oh, goodness.
For all because we wanted to meet them. They were all these characters, and they were also passionate and really smart about sports. So it was fun. But it was almost seemed like a fad in some ways. You didn't think it was going to make it. I remember when I was producing the show at WNBC, while we were doing the show, and we were on for several months, all of a sudden FAN announces they're going to have an all-sports show. And we're thinking, okay, we got a little competition now. And it comes on the air, and we listened to it for the first couple of days. And being the smug idiots that we were, we all looked at each other and said, come on, this will never last. And instead it just started everything. It was so new, and it was exciting, but you didn't know how it was gonna last, because, for example, when FAN started, they hired national names. They didn't hire New York people.
Sure. And
you quickly found out, at least in the early days, that sports talk, to really garner the listeners, had to be regional. It had to have that local flavor. Now that's changed because it's, obviously there's a lot of national, terrific and successful national sports talk shows. But at first, to get it going, you really had to focus on what the fans in that area cared about. Like for example, in New York, it was all Mets and Yankees and Knicks and Rangers. If you started talking about college football, your audience would just dip because it wasn't that big a deal here.
Yeah.
You started talking about soccer or even hockey to some extent, which wasn't as happy. You had to talk about what the local people really wanted to talk about. So it was the key was it had to be regional and localized in the early days.
What was it like? And I guess this goes back to doing it at Fordham, and this probably still applies now. But even early on in your career, and then when you started with the Knicks, kind of growing and breaking into this business in media market number one, and kind of cutting your teeth and becoming who you were in New York.
Well, I think, Joel, in some ways it was easier for me.
Okay.
Because I had grown up in New York, and I was a sports fan, and I had 5 brothers who were sports fans, and every friend I had was a sports fan. So in some ways, you felt like you were part of them. I've always felt that way as a Knick announcer. I'm one of them because that's who I was growing up. So you have a feel for maybe what they think, how they feel. I don't mean everybody, but the vast majority. And when you have a good background in terms of the history of the Knicks or the history of the Mets or any team in sports or the highs and lows of being a New York sports fan, I think it really helps you. I think it's difficult for somebody from the outside to come in and be an announcer, say, of a local team, just like it would be difficult for me to go and be the announcer of the Lakers. Sure, I'd have the fundamentals down to be able to, but I haven't been there my whole life. I haven't been through the roller coaster ride of what it is being a fan for a certain team. And I think that was a very big aid for me in the early going and gave me the confidence that I could be an announcer for the Knicks. And I never really thought of it as, New York. I mean, that's my hometown. That's where I lived my home life. So I think that was helpful in the early days.
Is there something unique to the microscope, though? I read the Ringer profile on you, and you talked about the dinner you guys had a couple of years back, where you got all of the New York play-by-play guys together, and you just kind of had stories of being New York voices. Is there something unique to being in that market and being with so many eyes and ears on you?
It's a good question. I don't know if it's unique as it used to be, but we certainly all think it is because of the way the fans react.
Sure.
I mean, there is no holding back on their opinion on what they think, if they like you or if they don't like you, if they agree with you on a certain player or they're on the complete opposite end of it. And I think that's what makes it so much fun. Fans are passionate in every city, so it might be hard for me to answer that with knowledge because, I know the guys in Boston who do the games there, their fans are just as passionate as we are.
Sure.
Are they different in terms of how they act toward their home team announcers? It's hard for me to say. I do know that in New York, for example, to please the fans, you have to, in some ways, you have to let them know you're rooting for that team. I mean, I'm a Knicks fan since I'm a kid, so I'm hoping Knicks fans know I want them to win every game when I'm broadcasting these games. But at the same time, you have to have a balance. They don't want you to sugarcoat. They don't want you in New York to tell you, the team is, they're really trying hard and they're playing great. No, if the team is lackadaisical and have no energy, they want you to say that. They want you to tell you when a certain player is having an awful night. They don't want you to sugarcoat it. And I don't know if it's the same across the country in terms of what the fans want. I do know in New York, they don't want that. They want you to be honest. But at the same time, they want you to, to let you know they're rooting for. I do have one story, Joel, that kind of opened my eyes a little bit about this off your question. The Knicks were in a stretch where they were really bad. And this particular year, it was such a tough year. They weren't talented enough. They weren't playing hard enough. And after one game, I walked out of the Garden, and a young man, probably in his early 30s, dressed in a suit, whole thing, he comes up and he says, "Hey, can I ask you a question?" And I said, sure. He goes, why do you hate the Knicks so much? And I was stunned by the question. I said, hate the Knicks? I said, I've been a Knicks fan since I was about 7 years old. What do you mean? He says, well, you're killing them on the air every night. I said, well, look at their record. There's not a lot of praise. There's not a lot of positive things to say. He goes, listen, I know they stink. I watch every game. But you don't have to tell me they stink every time they bring the ball up the court. And that really opened my eyes in terms of how you have to sometimes broadcast. You have to broadcast for your viewers. And at that point in the season, there were so many fans who were still watching, even though the team was terrible. And they knew they were terrible, but it was their team. This is their team. They love their team for, good days and bad days. And it made me realize, okay, yeah, I've got to state what's happening. I've got to be honest with the viewers. I can't sugarcoat it. But at the same time, you don't have to beat them over the head. There's other ways to get your viewers interested. It's like, talking about the development of a young player who might turn the ball over too much, but at the same time, he plays hard on defense. Things like that, where you have to balance that between being objective, being honest, don't sugarcoat, but at the same time, remember who you're broadcasting to. The majority are loyal, diehard Knicks fans who want any bit of good information to bring them back the next time.
That's probably changed a little bit over time, too, hasn't it, in terms of the way the NBA's developed and kind of being more of a, I don't want to say developmental league, but you get to the point where players are younger, they're coming out of college earlier, or certainly the years where they were coming out of high school, and you probably saw some things at the NBA level that you didn't see years and years ago, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think there are a lot of players who could have used more.
The patience factor, I guess.
Just to play more, right. Needed to play more fundamentally to get themselves prepared to play at this level. But you know what? Also, it's another way of looking at it is a lot depends on who your team is. If you're broadcasting a team that isn't supposed to be very good, it's only going to win 30 games. Well, they're going to play poorly on a number of nights, and you have to lower your expectations. Whereas if you have a team that, they got a chance to win the East and could win 55 to 60 games, and they're playing poorly, well, then you're a little harsher on them because they're underachieving. So a lot depends on, the talent on the roster and the expectations going into the season in terms of how you deal with, is this a good performance? A good performance for one team would be a horrible performance for another team just because of the expectations on a particular club that year.
That in mind, how do you approach a Knicks game versus a national game if you're on ESPN or if you're doing a Knicks game? Mindset-wise, preparation-wise, what is different for you on a day-to-day basis?
It's not as big a difference as some might think. Obviously, when I'm preparing for a Knicks game on MSG, I'm paying a little more attention to the specific players and specific notes that might not be of interest to a national level. Like, for example, Courtney Lee for the Knicks recently has had a really good stretch over 5 or 6 games. That might not be a stat that has a lot of interest if I'm doing the game on ESPN, but for Knicks fans, they're seeing that. Sure. Or more specifically, St. Frank Ntilikina, the rookie. Boy, he's starting to come on. So the last 3 games, he has 12 assists and 2 turnovers. That's an interesting fact for a Knicks fan. It's not an interesting fact for a national fan who's watching the game. So that's one difference. The other difference is basically if I'm doing an ESPN game and they're playing the Lakers, I try and balance the amount of comments I make, 50% on the Lakers and 50% on the Knicks. Whereas if it's an MSG game, my questions to Clyde, it's probably 75% Knicks and 25% opponent. So if the Knicks are up by 20 in the first quarter, if I'm doing MSG, I'm asking Clyde, boy, why are they playing so well? Why are they up by 20? But if I'm doing it with Jeff Van Gundy or Mark Jackson, I might be saying, why are the Lakers so awful to start this game? I mean, they're down by 20 in the first. So it's just minor tweaks and again, kind of reflecting on who your audience is.
What's the difference in a national nugget versus a local nugget? If you're going to, the 10 assists, 2 turnovers last 3 games is a good local kind of idea. Where is your focus at for things you think are more of national interest?
A lot depends on the player. For example, national interest, a lot of people tomorrow night, we're doing Knicks and Lakers. A lot of any Lonzo Ball stat, what's he shooting? What's he shooting in the last 5 games is of interest to the national audience. What Courtney Lee is shooting in the last 5 games might not be of interest because he's such a, Lonzo Ball right now is such a polarizing figure, or at least a player that people tune in to watch to see how the kid is doing. So it's more geared toward the players of interest. And obviously, say you're doing a Golden State game, the offensive numbers in terms of efficiency and shooting numbers are so off the charts. For example, I just did a Warriors game last week, and they had a 5-game stretch where they averaged 124 points a game and shot 54% from the field. That's an incredible number. Where I'm not going to be saying that about the Charlotte Hornets, like what's their shooting the last 5 games, unless it's something extraordinary, which it might be. So you can never say never, but that's kind of the way in terms of star players and star teams or elite teams.
Tell me about being a traffic cop a little bit, and in terms of getting to your analysts the best way possible, and how that changes too in terms of who you're working with. Best way that you go about getting the best you can out of Clyde versus, I'm sure, a totally different challenge in terms of working with Jeff and Mark.
Clyde is a little more laid back, so asking him specific questions is a little more necessary in terms of just trying to get him where he's feeling on a certain team or on a certain player. UB Brown, for example, you never really have to ask UB a question. He's as prepared as anybody I've ever seen with numbers. For example, when I do a game with Jeff and Mark, my preparation, I have more numbers and stats than I do with UB. For example, because Jeff and Mark, they don't rely on numbers that much. They're more of the eye test, the feel, whereas UB is very analytical with his numbers. So I don't have to prepare as many stats and numbers. In fact, I rarely bring them up on the air when I'm working with UB because he's so good with that. He applies that to the telecast so well that for me to add numbers, it becomes too many numbers. But when I work with Jeff and Mark, I put the numbers in because they don't go that route. So that's one of the differences. Jeff is also, number one, he kind of likes to ease himself into a game. He likes to see what's happening before he starts commenting. And I think that's one of the great things about Jeff and Mark is they don't feel the need to talk every time. They want to watch first before they comment. So with them, I might throw out some questions early just to get them going. But quite honestly, Joel, with all those, I don't need to be a traffic cop. They're also, I think that part is overrated because they're also talented. They're also knowledgeable. That all I've got to do is shut up every once in a while, and they're going to say something good.
How do you, and I guess this kind of, you touched on that a little bit, but how do you prepare in terms of knowing where they might want to go? What are those conversations like so that you're kind of all on the same page ahead of time? And that you know what they know what you know, and you've got an idea of what kind of arc to paint on a given night.
Well, the beauty of that is if you have dinner the night before,
okay,
and you talk about the game, and you find out what they're thinking about this player or that player. For example, if we're at dinner the night before and Mark's talking about Tim Hardaway and has some interesting things to say, in the back of my head, I'm saying, man, I got to ask him that early on in the game tomorrow. And even on the rides to the arena, you get in the car and you're driving together to the arena and you're discussing certain things and you really play off that. That's why, having the relationship outside of just the telecast can be instrumental in terms of how you handle. Now, there are other instances where, it's actually fun and surprising when it's spontaneous and you don't know when it's coming. But there are other times too where, when you prepare ahead of time, you can really focus in on something and you can tell the producer, hey, we're going to talk about so-and-so, and they might put an ISO camera on them for a little bit. So it's a little bit of both. But I think the more you talk to your partner off the air, the better feel you get for what they're thinking about the teams and specific players.
The prep side for you in particular, I forget which. There was one story I was reading where it talked about, night before you're a lot of times in the hotel studying up on different statistics and things like that. How do you decide? And Al Troutwig tweeted out the picture of your boards too, which I thought was incredible because of the amount of detail that's on there. Kind of, how do you decide what goes on there? How do you know where it is? What's your organization process like to make sure that your head is where it needs to be, just in regards to yourself?
Well, I've always tried to say with for an NBA game now there's 13 players active for each team per game, so that's 26 players. If each player, any of the 26, has the game of their life. And for the 13th player, it could be he plays 10 minutes and scores 6 points. It's the game of his life. It's the best he's ever played.
Sure.
For your star player, if he goes off for 50, you have to be able to tell a little story about them. So you have to have information on all 26, just a little something, even if that last guy goes off in garbage time. It's a 30-point game. And the telecast has 4 minutes to go in what's been an awful blowout. And all of a sudden, this last guy on the bench gets in, and he explodes in the last 3 minutes.
It's probably more important there.
Correct. So you have to have something for everybody. That's number one. That's the first rule. The second rule is you could do all this great preparation, and I can have 5 so-called nuggets on player number 10. But if player number 10 gets 2 fouls in the first minute and hardly plays the rest of the way, I'm not throwing those nuggets in there because it doesn't apply to the game. You have to let the game dictate where you go with all your information. Now, there are exceptions to that. If there's a really, really interesting personal story that happened in the person's life or something they did off the court that was, a great human interest tidbit, well, then you can veer off that. I've had producer Ken Wolf, who's been producing for a long time. He told me that one time we had this unbelievable soundbite on a player talking about I think it was about his mom, and the player hardly had an impact on the game, but it was such a touching soundbite. And I was like, yeah, but he's not playing, Kenny. And he's like, it doesn't matter. This rises above that. And we played the soundbite. And that's all anybody talked to me about after the game. Friends I knew who watched the game. How about that? What he said. So in most cases, the game dictates unless you have something that you really feel has great human interest or is an exceptional aspect of a player's life, et cetera, to do. But I think the key is still to go with whatever the game dictates you after you make sure you have something prepared for all 26 players.
How do you find something unique on certain guys? I'm sure it's probably easier on some ends, but when you go into a game and you're saying, I want to find something that might be new, a national audience hasn't heard about Kristaps, or, what about Kobe? How do you continue to find something 20 years into a guy's career that might be something that would surprise, shock, or educate an audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really hard to find something new because, quite frankly, the most players now, it's all the stuff is uncovered early on. And back when I first started, when I first started games, you'd get off the plane. And the first thing you do when you get off the plane in the airport, and at this point we weren't flying on team's charter, you would grab the local paper, and you would try and get a nugget or two from the local stories out of the local paper because there was no internet. It was really hard. It was all by talking to guys and trying to get stuff out of them when you talk to them in person. And that's changed so much with the internet and social media. And not only now the NBA has some unbelievable national writers and local writers who have so much great information on not only the games, but on players. So what you do now is you follow them, you read as much as you can, and then what you find out from them, you try and advance it to make it your own a little bit. You obviously have to give credit, but that's when you read things and then you go to the person and you ask them about it. But it's so much easier today because there's so much information out there. And even now the players, with the Players Tribune, now they're writing their own stories to get their own information out there.
Yeah.
So it's almost a matter, Joel, of at some point you have to say, okay, enough. I've prepared enough. You went from you could never prepare enough to now, okay, I can't read one more article.
Yeah.
I've over-prepared here. You have to draw the line at some point, and say, okay, it's still about the game. I've got enough nuggets on each of these guys where, all right, let's shut off the computer and let's get some sleep and get ready for the game. But to answer your initial question, it's hard now because there's so much information out there to uncover something new.
You had mentioned Ken Wolf, the producer, a couple answers ago, and I wanted to ask you about an anecdote I found from him where he had talked about rewatching some of your stuff, which I always think is an intriguing topic to talk to guys about, particularly of your stature. And he had said, he found one game that you had done. I think had watched 5 in a row, and said that, hey, you sound a little bit uninterested in this one, and if it was the first game that somebody caught of you, that would be their opinion. What kind of feedback do you still get from people at this point? How much do you still rewatch your own stuff? And what are the types of things that maybe you still find that you want to work on or that bug you or that you could be better at that would surprise somebody to hear coming from somebody like Mike Breen?
Well, I have, and I've always had 3 or 4 people in my life that I will call and say, hey, do me a favor, you get a chance, either watch or tape my game on Sunday and give me some feedback. And the people are, one of them is Ken Wolf, a producer who just knows the ins and outs. There's a couple of other, I won't name them all, but another one is another play-by-play guy. Another one is a dear friend who's never been in the business, but is the biggest sports fan I know, and he just watches every single game. So you try and get different opinions from different angles. And my message is always to them, I want you to tell me what you really think. I don't want you to say, oh, you did a great job. You can say that if you think that, but I want some critique. I want you to tell me what I need to hear, not what I want to hear. And that's worked pretty well in some of them over the years. One other person who's listened to games for me and given me great feedback over the years is Mike Francesa, because he's really honest, as was Kenny Wolf. The aforementioned Mike McCarthy was another one who's always been great with feedback. And again, you just want them to tell you stuff that you could do a little bit better. When I watch, and I'm going to say twice a year, I'll sit and watch a game that I did. I probably won't watch the whole thing because, like just about every announcer, you hate to hear your own voice. But the one thing that still drives me crazy, but I still can get better on, there are 2 things actually. There was more than 2, but these 2 particular is the whole thing of talking too much. There's sometimes I'll rewatch a game and I'm watching, I'm saying, geez, will you just be quiet for a minute? Because we all prepare and we all have a lot of information and we want to share it, but you don't have to share it every second of the telecast. Sometimes it's so wonderful to just hear the crowd and let the play go up and down a couple of times. So that's number 1 for me. Am I talking too much? Another thing is you tend to use the same crutch words to describe things. And you have to mix that up a little bit. Every play, oh, that can't be a great play, or, oh, that was spectacular. If you use the word spectacular 4 times in a broadcast, that's too much. You got to find different ways. So something I do is I'll get a thesaurus, and if I'm using a word to describe an unbelievable play too much, I'll find another word to use in there because that's it. So vocabulary, changing up the vocabulary, and also the idea of making sure you don't talk too much. Those are the 2 things I really watch for.
What makes a call worthy of bang, or does it just come out in the right moment? And do you have to watch how often you do it too?
What's that?
And do you have to watch how often you use it too?
Yes, I don't think I've ever done it. more than twice in a game. Maybe one time or two times I've done it 3, but I try and only use it once a game. There's been a bunch of occasions where it's twice, but I don't think, to me, that's what you have to, less is more. If I started doing it all the time, it would sound ridiculous. And what's worthy of it is more of a feel of the crowd, of the situation. Rarely I use it in the first half, but sometimes a team goes on an amazing run. They're playing at a level that we've rarely seen. The crowd is just, out of seats, and it works. But it's only a 3-pointer. I've decided it's only a 3-pointer. That might change too, depending on the moment. But it's usually a 3-pointer that has an unbelievable momentum swing to it in terms of the crowd. And and part of the reason, Joel, too, is, and I usually only use it for hometown, for the home team that hits it. When I'm doing Knick games, obviously I'll use it on the road for Knick games, but from national, it's mostly the home team. And a big part of that is the crowd is going so crazy for the home team. When a big shot is made, you can't try and scream over the crowd. You can't do it. It's just too loud. Plus, to me, it enhances the telecast, the crowd going crazy. So a quick one-syllable word and you're out, and let the crowd take it is better. If I'm trying to go 10 to 15 seconds with my voice at a really high level, trying to fight the crowd, it's not going to sound well. So a lot of it has to do with, is it the home team that's hit it? Is it a momentum hitting shot? Things like that are all part of it. But most of it, it's just a feel on how the game is going.
This is going to be a bigger bite here, but I'll see what direction you go with it. What makes good basketball on television? If you sat down and watched yourself or watched anything, how would you diagram up what you want to hear from a play-by-play person?
I want to know that the play-by-play person there's no place you'd rather be than at that game. That's number one, that you could tell he loves basketball or she loves basketball. Number two, that they know the teams, and that they've obviously prepared. You can tell sometimes in the first 5 minutes of a telecast if a guy is really prepared, if a gal is really prepared, or if they just they're going into the game not winging it, but they're not super prepared. The other thing is, do they like their partner? Now this gets a little tricky because sometimes you can tell right away. Man, oh man, these guys get along great. It's really fun listening to two people that get along and are having fun with each other.
Sure.
Sometimes that's natural. Sometimes it's you have to fake it. I mean, not every play-by-play guy and color analyst get along, and I'm sure there's been plenty of them over time where they sound like they're great friends, but once the game ends, they rarely spend time together. And I've been super fortunate, and I've never, I'm not just saying this. I pretty much loved every guy I've worked with. I've been so blessed with people who I have such respect for and admiration, but at the same time enjoy being around. And I think that's important to the telecast from the viewer at home. If the two guys like each other and sound like they're having a good time, you're like part of it. You're like the third wheel in there, or the fourth wheel if it's a 3-man team. So I think those are three important aspects. You've got to show that you have passion and your energy. You got to be prepared, and you have to be able to make it seem like you and your partner are having the best time together.
How important is voice, and how long have you sounded like this? What kind of work went into crafting your sound the way it is?
I don't think I've ever crafted anything. It's always just kind of you have to be who you. I mean, this sounds so cliche. I apologize, but you can't try and fake who you are.
Sure.
So I've never really tried to craft it. The only thing I've tried to do is, I grew up in Yonkers, and where I come from, it's not Yonkers, it's Yonkers, and I've had to kind of try and get my Yonkers accent out. So that's the one thing I've tried to get my New York accent out a little bit to be more of a neutral accent, neutral voice. Not that I'm ashamed. I love where I came from, but just I think it's more professional to sound that way. So that's the only thing I did. I look back at tapes or listen to tapes when I was younger, and I can't believe people hired me. I sounded like I had this little squeaky voice. And I still don't have, in my opinion, I don't have one of the great set of pipes. There's so many people out there now that
I will trade you today if you.
Well, I mean, compared to like Kevin Harlan's and a guy like Dan Schulman, who has such a great voice, Joel Myers, these guys have the classic play-by-play voices. But I think one of the best parts of the industry over the last 10 to 15 years is you don't need that great deep voice anymore. It's more about what's the quality of the word I'm looking for. It's the content, not necessarily the quality of the voice. It's the content of what you say that's more important. Now you still have to have, a voice that can override a crowd and that can be semi-pleasing to a viewing audience. But I think the content is just as important now, and that, to me, that's a great development over recent years.
Oh, I don't want to keep you too much longer, so a couple real quick things if I can, or I guess I think they're quick. I do want to ask you about, so often what events come to mind or what big things have you dealt with in your career broadcast-wise. I wanted to ask about one thing in particular, and it ties back to kind of what you talked about at the beginning in terms of covering news and being able to break down things that are not sports and, kind of make sure all your facts are in order. What was it like broadcasting the Malice at the Palace from the standpoint of being a play-by-play announcer, but also, realizing at the time that you're, I don't want to say covering a story, but at the same time, kind of covering a story in some sense, and realizing that you're not just calling a game anymore, and how to be the voice in that situation.
Joel, it really is, regardless of if you're covering a story or a sporting event, it's basically the same principles. I mean, you're reporting on live reporting on what's happening in front of you that people are watching. I think what made it easier for me that particular night was in the year, that season and the season before, I think I had broadcast 10 fairly big brawls because the Knicks seemed to be always getting in scraps and fights, whether it's, the Alonzo Mourning, whether it's Kevin Johnson, Doc Rivers, whether it's Derek Harper and JoJo English. I was a veteran blow-by-blow announcer by the time that Palace incident happened, because there were a lot of fights then. And I'm sure if I went back to the first basketball fight that I broadcast, I'm sure I sounded hysterical in calling it. But like anything, once you do it a few times, you figure out the best way to do it. And the best way to do it was, at that particular time, just describe what you see. Just describe the various things in terms of the big picture in the arena, not just the what's going on the monitor that the fans at home can see, but the overall, what's going on. Just describe what you see. And then when it's over, when it settles down, then I think you can bring in your feeling on what just happened. Then I think you can comment and editorialize. But while it's going on, I think the most important thing is not to lose your emotions then. Just keep reporting what's in front of you. Keep telling the people what you see up close. And once it settles down, then you can decide, okay, what does this mean? Where does that stand in terms of the big picture? How would you handle it? Things like that. The editorializing comes afterwards.
Where were you sitting? And do you worry while that's going on that this could get out of hand somewhere near my vicinity?
Oh, there's no question. Now, we were on the opposite side of the benches. The national broadcasts are on the opposite side. Obviously, the team broadcasters were on the same side. In fact, Mark Boyle, a good friend and the longtime voice of the Pacers, he was right there in the middle of it when they came crashing into him. But we were on the other side. And in some ways, for the job that we had to do, and I was with Bill Walton and Jim Gray that night, it was almost better being a step back. But what I was worried about was, I looked behind me and the crowd was surging down at both ends. And that was the concern. If the crowd is now leaving their seats and coming towards the court, that's what we were worried, that if any, a mob of fans came on the floor, then this would be, get to the point of no return. And on both sides, the fans were coming down towards the court, and that's what we were hoping, that it would end soon, because once one was broken up, another one started. So it just kept seeming like it was going on and on. And I told this story many times before. There was a woman in the crowd who was standing over the tunnel where the players were leaving. They tried to get the Pacers out of there. And I felt bad for this woman. She was very nicely dressed, and she seemed a little distraught with what was going on. And, people were throwing things at the players as they're coming across. And I'm like, boy, can they get this poor woman out of there? And all of a sudden, she reaches with her right hand and takes a full bottle of water, and she's only a couple of feet away from the players, and just pegs it at one of the players' heads. And at that point, I remember thinking in myself, this is what a mob mentality is. There's no way this person would ever act like that. But they got caught up in the mob mentality of everybody throwing things at the players, and that's how things can quickly escalate with a mob mentality. So there was a point where it was very scary. We wondered, are they going to be able to calm this thing down? And fortunately, they eventually did. But that's a night I'll never ever forget.
Hey, that's Mike Breen, the New York Knicks television voice, and of course the voice of the NBA Finals on television, joining us here on episode 80 of Play-by-Playcast. I mean, was I right on that one? Is that not one of our? Is that not one of our better episodes that we've had so far? I've said that multiple times, but I thoroughly enjoyed being able to spend almost an hour with Mike Breen, and it's amazing too. Even listening, the critique side of things is what I found fascinating with Mike, in terms of how much he still watches back, how much he still has other people watch back, even at the level he is at, and the things that he looks for, even at his level, critiquing how much, the talking too much side of things, I thought was fascinating. I thought getting new information was an interesting part of that conversation as well. Doing what he does at the level that he does, with the amount of coverage that there is, particularly in the NBA, particularly in New York now, how you continuously unearth something new. The foundations of I think really solid play-by-play is both, relaying and conveying what you see in front of you, but also informing and educating the viewer or listener. So how do you do that? It's one thing. Here's Kobe Bryant. He was, out of high school and great in Philadelphia. How do you tell somebody something new about Kobe Bryant when there is so much out there? I thought that was kind of interesting to get Mike's perspective on as well. And I was curious to ask about the Mouse at the Palace as well, because there's been some stuff written on that. But it was cool to kind of re-dredge that up and kind of relive that history and what it was like to convey that firsthand, and kind of have to be not just a play-by-play broadcaster, but a newscaster as well, which went back to kind of where that whole conversation started. Awesome. I was pumped to get Mike Breen on. So excited that we were finally able. We played phone tag for a little bit, so I was super stoked that we were able to have Mike Breen on the pod this week. Next week, another really good guest coming your way. He's the radio voice of the TCU Horned Frogs. Brian Estridge will round out 2017 as our guest next Friday. Rich Burke comes up after that. Ann Schatz will be on the podcast as well. Our second female play-by-play voice. We'll talk about Ann Schatz's career, which is a fascinating one. So that's the next couple of weeks that lie ahead here on Play-by-Playcast. Many thanks, as always, to you guys for making this podcast go, for hitting subscribe, for hitting download, for rating or reviewing the pod. Many thanks to Mike Breen for joining us, and that'll do it for us this week. Brian Estridge, our guest next week from the TCU Horned Frogs. Until then, we are out. So hit it, Marshmallow.
And that will do it from St. Louis, where the score is inconclusive.